Hello class, and this is going to bring us to our final chapter for our course, Chapter 18, focusing on rent, interest, and profit. And we're going to look about how rent is determined and how it factors into interest as well as profits to be made. So we're going to look at what is known as economic rent, interest, the loanable funds theory of interest rates, time value of money, role of interest rates, economic profit, and income shares. If you take another course I teach, Management 1003, we go much deeper into things like time value of money and interest rates and all of that. And if you plan on taking accounting courses, you will view this stuff as well. So what is economic rent? And we use the term rent in the real world to define what is known as economic rent, or the price paid for land or other natural resources. So it's the price paid for the use of land and other natural resources that are completely fixed in total supply. We can't make or take away land for the most part, so we can build taller buildings, but land is what is pretty much totally fixed in supply. And this fixed overall supply distinguishes rental payments from wages, interest, and profit payments. For all practical purposes, we would say the supply of land is inelastic, and it gives us a vertical supply curve. Because the supply of land is fixed, demand is the only active determinant. This is once again simplistic. In real life, you can build bigger buildings, but that does take time. So in the short run, we would say that the amount of land is certainly fixed. If we were talking about rent for apartments, if we're talking about rent for physical land, that's obviously not something you can really create more of. Demand for land is driven by how productive is it, the demand for the products produced on the land, and the prices of other resources that are combined with the land along with its location. Real land does indeed have a perfectly inelastic supply, so there are no incentive payments associated with it. So economists therefore consider land rents to be surplus payments that are not necessary to ensure that land is made available for economic use. No matter what rent is paid, the land will always be there, so there's no incentive function associated with the price of it. So if we look here, what are the determinant for land rent? Well, once again, it's a fixed supply. We can't create or take away land. If we look at rent of things like apartments, you could, in a long enough period of time, create more or build more houses, but at least in the short run, that would look exactly the same as this. So we have a fixed supply of overall land in this area we're looking at, and we have different demand curves. So we have different demand curves in the sense that an increase from D2 to D1 or a decrease from D2 to D3 is going to change your rent, the intersection points, quite considerably. If demand is very weak, and I'll switch to red for this one, D4, land will be a free good commanding no rent. So if demand is very weak, you wouldn't be able to rent the land because no one's going to want to use it. No matter what you try to charge, no one's going to rent it because there's really no demand for that land. So if you see abandoned lots or something like that, that would be an example. Maybe it's in a not desirable location, or really no one has any idea of what to do with it. That would be a situation like that. So land ownership. Is private land ownership fair? Because we're allocating a scarce resource. So socialists have argued that land is a gift of nature and land rents are unearned income since its owners who rent it out produce nothing, and therefore they should be heavily taxed and not reduce the supply of land. However, supporters of private ownership have argued that private ownership forces owners to consider their opportunity costs and use the land for its best use, and actually results in surplus payments from a societal point of view. Markets are used to reflect changes in the value of land based on new technologies and economic growth. If all land was owned by the government, it would be very difficult for the government to identify the best use of it with a lack of market signals. Economic rents do not cause land to be supplied, they cause land to be directed. What is this land being used for? Is it being used for the best possible purpose? In the United States, criticism of rental payments produced what was known as the single tax movement at the end of the 1800s, and supporters of this movement held that economic rent could be heavily taxed without diminishing the available supply of land or reducing the efficiency with which it is associated. And this concept was created in response to the idea that private ownership of land results in unfair allocations. It was spearheaded by a man named Henry George, and it was based upon allowing land to remain in private hands, but to then tax the land based upon the rent it earns, allowing private landowners to allocate it to their best use, but it would be heavily taxed. It was argued society would benefit because the land would be used for its best purpose, but a portion of the rent would be directed from the landowner to society. At the time, this was heavily criticized, who argued it would not produce enough revenue for the government to operate, and it would be difficult to isolate exactly what the rent was for the land. Basically, they wanted to fund the government fully by doing this. They argued that other individuals are also the recipients of unearned income, and since land is frequently sold at higher and higher prices, it would not be fair to impose a heavy tax on the recent buyer only. This obviously did not come to pass, but you could make arguments both for and against private land ownership. Obviously, in our society, private land ownership is one of the cornerstones of our economy and market-based economies in general. So what is interest? Interest is something we've touched upon. If you certainly touched upon it in macroeconomics, we've touched upon it throughout this class, and also if you've taken accounting, if you've taken any sort of finance class, interest is something you've run into quite a bit. And interest simply is the price paid for the use of money. That's the cost of money, and it's given as a percentage. Now, money isn't a resource. It's not something you can mine from the ground. And the reason we don't consider money an economic resource is it on its own is not very useful. We have to convert money into goods and services, capital goods, buy things with it. Money is a means to an end, but just a pile of money on its own is not useful economically. It's useful once you convert it into something you can then use for economic means. Interest rates determine a household's interest income. So interest rates are what we pay, what we earn if we lend money, and generally a mix of both. We make interest on our investments, we pay interest on things like our loans, like our mortgages or our car loans or student loans. So interest rates are the cost of money. And there are differences in risk, maturity, loan size, and taxability. So the higher the risk of something, the greater the interest rate. Credit cards have very high interest rates because they're very risky, whereas a home mortgage is backed by the house, much less risky. The longer a maturity will affect an interest rate. Longer loans usually have higher interest rates due to the likelihood that other factors might change. That rate might be good now, but if there's a lot of inflation, it may not be good 10 years down the line. Loan size. Larger loans generally have smaller interest rates than smaller ones. Think of a home mortgage or something like that. Larger loans have less of an interest component based on the size. And taxability. If the interest is tax exempt, the borrower will receive a lower rate. So keep that in mind there. And the pure rate of interest is a hypothetical risk-free rate and only compensates investors for time preference. No interest rate that we pay or earn is a pure rate of interest. They are all modified by things such as risk. They're modified by things such as time. They're modified by things such as inflation. All of that stuff is what's modifying the interest rates we pay. The pure rate of interest is hypothetical. Here were various interest rates as of 2021. These have since gone up quite a bit due to inflation. In 2021, at the end of 2021, a 30-year mortgage was only 3.23%. Now they're pushing about 8%, and that's directly a consequence of inflation. This is the newest edition of this book, too, and this data is still quite a bit out of date now due to that fact. As you can see here, credit cards are so much higher. Why? Credit cards are very risky, and they're not backed by anything. A car loan or a home loan, they're backed by a physical asset. If you don't pay your bill, your home or your car can get taken by the bank and it has value, whereas a credit card is not backed by anything. So they have very high interest rates because they're very risky. So this is just a selection of various rates. Loanable funds theory of interest. This explains the interest rate on any particular type of loan in terms of supply and demand for how many people want that type of loan and how much money exists to fund that type of loan. And this can be made for any type of loan we can think of. Generally, loans are obtained through financial institutions such as a bank. Banks pay interest to savers to attract loanable funds, and in turn will lend those funds to businesses. The bank profits by charging a higher rate to the borrower than they pay to the saver, so the bank makes money. Anything that causes households to save more will shift the supply curve rightward, more money to then lend out. Banks take your money and make loans with it. A decline in savings will shift it leftward if the bank has less money to lend out. Changes in demand come when the rate of return on potential investments increases or decreases. Depending on what the market is for money, if the economy is doing very poorly, you're probably not going to see very big demand for loans. If the economy is doing well and there's good rates of return on potential investments, people are going to borrow money to use. And there are other participants besides households and businesses. The Federal Reserve, or the Central Bank of the United States, controls the amount of bank activity and has a wide influence on interest rates. The government also has an impact on the lending process by granting special tax treatment for different types of interest. For instance, your home mortgage, you could write that interest off of your taxes. You can write student loan interest off of your taxes. That's the government getting involved in the lending process. So this is just the loanable funds market, supply for money and demand for money, and quantity of loanable funds. The equilibrium here is an interest rate of 8%. It's not specifying, but supply upslopes, demand downslopes as usual, and at that intersection or the center is where we would say is equilibrium, or that would be the interest rate currently for this type of loan would be 8%, where everything being demanded, all the money being demanded is being supplied. Equilibrium. Time value of money is an important point. You will run into this quite a bit more, once again, if you take Management 1003 with me or another instructor, or if you take accounting or any other type of finance class. We cover time value of money quite extensively. Time value of money is important. It's the notion that money is more valuable the sooner it is obtained. As the fact that money generally becomes worth less over time due to things like inflation and interest, money today is worth more than the same amount of money in the future. If I could give you $100 today or $100 a year from now, you would want it today for that reason. Since money can earn interest and that interest compounds, meaning we earn interest on our interest, if we put $100 in a bank and earn 10% a year, first year we have 110. The second year we're now going to make 10% on 110 instead of 100. So we will make, instead of $10 interest, we'll make $11 interest that year. That's compounding. So money becomes more and more valuable over time due to its ability to earn interest. And we have what is known as a future value and a present value, and that takes into account that rate. Would be the future value, excuse me, not your 1,210. Your $1,331 would be your future value of your $1,000. Relationship to total output, role of interest rates. So in addition to compounding, interest rates are important because they allocate capital and R&D spending. How are we going to spend our money? How are we going to use our capital goods? Lower equilibrium interest rates encourage businesses to borrow more, and spending's going to go up. Low rates heat up the economy. It's going to be attractive to borrow money and spend because it's cheap to do so. Since interest rates are prices, they allow for the allocation of the available supply of loanable funds to investment projects that have expected returns at or above the interest rate. You would not want to borrow money and then put it into a project if you expect to earn less money than you would have to pay on your interest, for instance. If you can borrow money at 10%, but your investment's only going to pay 5%, you're actually losing money. So you're going to want to borrow money and put it into projects that are going to be profitable. Decisions to spend on research and development will also be influenced by the interest rate, and it's important to distinguish between nominal and real. So nominal interest rate is your rate of interest in terms of dollars of current value. The real is where it's being adjusted for inflation. So your nominal interest rate is the base rate, and then whatever the percentage of inflation is, adjust the real rate. Remember, money loses value over time due to inflation. So if the base rate's 5%, but we're running 4% inflation, the real rate, or what you would pay, is 9%. 5% of it is what the bank is earning. The other 4% is just keeping pace with inflation. It's the real rate that affects investment and R&D decisions because that is what we're actually borrowing money at. Many states have passed what are referred to as usury laws, which are price ceilings because the law specifies a maximum interest rate at which loans can be made. If we specify a maximum rate, the government is interfering with equilibrium. And this could cause non-market rationing because there may be a shortage of loanable funds. If you are prevented from charging more than a certain rate of interest and it's deemed riskier than that, banks aren't going to want to loan money. Creditworthy borrowers gain from usury laws because generally they pay below market interest rates, and the below market rates will promote inefficiency since less productive projects may receive financing. So same effect as we covered at the beginning of this class with the notion of price floors and price ceilings. They can interfere with the free market. This was as of 2020, various interest rates. The United States was very low. These have all since changed quite a bit due to inflation. And short-term interest rates can even be negative. If we look at Germany or Switzerland, they're approaching negative 1%. That is an example of deflation. Money is becoming worth more over time. It's rare, but it's possible. You generally see them in times of economic slowdown that you may see negative rates. Economic or pure profit, this is just simply your revenue minus your costs. And what are we doing here? So economists define profit very narrowly. Accountants define it as what is left over after all the bills are paid. The economist defines it as what is left over after both our explicit costs, our expenses, and our implicit costs have been covered. Implicit costs are the monetary income the firm sacrifices when it uses resources it owns rather than supplying them to the market, and includes a normal profit. Basically, opportunity costs. Economic profits are sometimes referred to as pure profits because they're taking into account all of our bills or our explicit costs and all of our opportunity costs or our implicit or subjective ones. Economic profit flows to the individuals and motivates them to provide the economic resource known as entrepreneurship. If you didn't have a chance of making money by opening your own business, you would really not want to be an entrepreneur. The profits that you can make is your motivator. So the entrepreneur gets what's left after the residual revenue after all costs and a normal profit included have been subtracted from total revenue. So economic profit takes into account our entrepreneur and takes into account opportunity costs. So what are some risks? We have both insurable and uninsurable risks. Insurable risks are risks that we can mitigate by buying insurance. We put an insurance policy on our factory in case it burns down. We have car insurance, life insurance. Those are all insurable risks. But you cannot always buy insurance against risk. It is not possible to live in a risk-free world. So we try to buy insurance to things that we deem appropriate or risks that we deem appropriate to our business. So obviously fire insurance on a factory is important. Workers' compensation coverage, insuring our employees, things like that. Providing health insurance to our employees in case they have issues. Those are all examples of insurable risks. But what are uninsurable risks? Those are things that we can't buy an insurance contract to try to mitigate, and they fall into 4 categories. The first includes things like changes in the overall economy, like a recession. We can't insure against a recession. We could try to take proactive steps to put money away or have a plan in place if the economy hits a recession, but we can't buy recession insurance. That does not exist. Second is changes in the structure of the economy. Consumer taste, technology, and price changes occur unpredictably. You could have been the world's greatest manufacturer of VCRs, but the economy changed. No one wanted VCRs anymore. That is a risk that you couldn't insure away, but obviously if you did not change your business model, would have put you out of business. Changes in government policy, such as new laws or regulations, are another source of uninsurable risk. Actual companies try to lobby the government to prevent this, but if the government goes ahead and bans whatever you make, for instance, let's say you're making a pharmaceutical drug which gets outlawed by the government because it is dangerous or addictive, well, in that case, you couldn't insure against that risk, but you may certainly go out of business as a consequence. Or finally, new products or production methods. You were the greatest manufacturer of flip phones, but smartphones came out in the mid-2000s. That's a new product. Or someone comes up with a method to make what you make so much cheaper, so much faster, with less resources. Those are all things we can't insure away either. But all of these are real risks faced by businesses every day. If you run into these risks, what can happen? You could suddenly lose sales, revenue, you could go out of business. All the types of risks faced by businesses, many of them are not insurable. So profit is compensation for bearing uninsurable risks. There's no such thing as a free lunch, and there's no such thing as a surefire business. Every business has risk. So the profits you earn are your compensation for putting up your money, risking your money to launch this business or fund this business and take on these risks. So they serve as compensation to the entrepreneur for personally taking on the risks of running a business. In exchange for making sure that everybody gets paid, and if things go wrong, the entrepreneur gets to keep the firm's profits when they go right. So entrepreneurs take on a lot of risk, but they could also reap a lot of reward. And there are three main ways they can do so. So they can create popular new products. So think of Apple creating the iPhone, or Tesla launching their modern electric cars, so world-changing products that became popular. They could reduce production costs. That's not as sexy as inventing a new product, but it's just as important. If you run a car company and you find a way to build cars for half the price of your competitor with some new equipment, it's going to make you a ton of money. It may not be the splashy product launch like Steve Jobs launching the iPhone, but it may make you just as much, if not more. Or creating and maintaining a profitable monopoly. If you can monopolize your product or have a product that no one can duplicate or no one can successfully duplicate, it doesn't even have to be a monopoly where you're putting other people out of business, but if you invent a new pharmaceutical drug and patent it and market it, or you have the formula to something famous like Coca-Cola. There are plenty of other soda companies, but none of them are Coca-Cola. So if you could do that, you can obviously reap a lot of profits as well. So profits are distributed beyond the entrepreneur. So if you own stock in a company, you get to share in the profits. And it's the main energizer of our capitalistic economy. We can allocate resources in a way that is beneficial to society. Investors generally will invest in profitable companies, and ones that can't compete go out of business. People aren't going to want to buy the stock in a company that's in terrible financial shape or is making products no one wants, and they probably will fail. So why do you buy stock in companies? Because you expect them to do well and you get to share some of the profits. And here's distribution of U.S. income, just under 70% wages and salaries, 4% rents, about 10% interest, about 7% from profits, and about 10% from proprietors' income. And that was as of 2020. Narrowly defining labor as just wages and salaries, labor is almost 70% of all income earned by Americans in a typical year. And finally, how do we determine the price of credit? There are many forms of borrowing, and the interest paid on those loans can be difficult to determine. It's important for an individual to pay attention to how it's calculated. In 1968, we passed the Truth in Lending Act, and in 1991, the Truth in Savings Act, and they've attempted to clarify interest charges and payments for consumers. But the thing is, when it comes time to borrowing, the old adage, caveat emptor, or let the borrower beware, is still a fitting motto in the world of credit. Caveat emptor is let the buyer beware, but same logic. Let the borrower beware is still a fitting motto. If you plan on taking out loans, opening credit cards, borrowing to fund a business, read the fine print, all of the terms of the loan, the interest you're paying. How is it going to work? When do you have to repay this loan? Don't simply sign on the dotted line and take on a loan without fully understanding what are you borrowing. There are things like fees that are hidden and teaser rates. That means your rate is cheap for a few periods and then goes way up. There may be hidden fees. Their loan may have to have certain amounts paid back at certain times. What's the actual interest rate you're paying? Does it have any tax consequences in positive or negative light? That's all stuff you want to look at before you just simply borrow, and that applies to any form of loan. That's going to take us to the very end of this chapter, and also the very end of our course.